Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more notable names in Jewish American history. Well, today we shall be looking at Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Since we did Justice Louis Brandeis already, I figured why not keep it going and go with another Jewish American judge. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born in Brooklyn, New York on March the 15th, 1933, and married Martin D. Ginsburg in 1954 and had a daughter, Jane, and a son, James. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Cornell University, attended Harvard Law School, and received her LL.B. from Columbia Law School. She served as a law clerk to the Honorable Edmund L. Palmieri, Judge of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York from 1959 to 1961. And from 61 to 63, she was a research associate for and then associate director of the Columbia Law School Project on International Procedure. She was professor of law at Rutgers University School of Law in 1963 to 1972 and Columbia Law School from 1972 to 1980. And a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Stanford, California from 77 to 78. In 1971, she co-founded the Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties Union and served as the ACLU's General Counsel from 1973 to 1980. And on the National Board of Directors from 1974 to 1980. She served on the board and executive committee of the American Bar Foundation from 1979 to 1989, on the board of editors of the American Bar Association Journal from 1972 to 1978, and on the Council of the American Law Institute from 1978 to 1993. She was appointed a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals and for the District of Columbia Circuit in 1980, D.C., Washington, D.C., so. President Clinton nominated her as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and she took her seat August 10th, 1993, and would pass away September 18th, 2020. So that was from SupremeCourt.gov. Let's look at Oyez, what they have to say. She spent a lifetime flourishing in the face of diversity before being appointed a Supreme Court Justice, where she successfully fought against gender discrimination and unified the liberal bloc of the court. She was born Joan Ruth Bader on March 15, 1933 in Brooklyn, New York. Her father was a furrier in the height of the Great Depression, and her mother worked in a garment factory. Her mother instilled a love of education in Ginsburg through her dedication to her brother, foregoing her own education to finance her brother's college expenses. Her mother heavily influenced her early life and watched Ginsburg excel at James Madison High School, but was diagnosed with cancer and died the day before Ginsburg's high school graduation, which Ginsburg also finally passed away after several bouts with cancer. So Ginsburg's success in academia continued throughout her years at Cornell University, where she graduated at the top of her class in 1954. That same year, Ruth Bader became Ruth Bader Ginsburg after marrying her husband, Martin Ginsburg. And after graduation, she put her education on hold to start a family. She had the first child in 1955, shortly after her husband was drafted for 2 years of military service, which that would have been Korean War. Upon her husband's return from his service, Ginsburg enrolled at Harvard Law. So yeah. Ginsburg's personal struggles neither decreased in intensity nor deterred her in any way from teaching and exceeding her academic goals, even when her husband was diagnosed with testicular cancer in 1956 during her first year of law school. Ginsburg took on the challenge of keeping her sick husband up to date with his studies, while maintaining her own position at the top of the class. At Harvard, Ginsburg tackled the challenges of motherhood and of a male-dominated school where she was one of 9 females in a 500-person class. She faced gender-based discrimination from even the highest authorities there, who chastised her for taking a man's spot at Harvard Law. She served as the first female member of the Harvard Law Review, and her husband recovered from cancer, graduated from Harvard, and moved to New York to accept a position at a law firm there. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had 1 more year of law school left, so she transferred to Columbia Law School in New York City and served on their law review as well. She graduated first in her class at Columbia Law in 1959. Even her exceptional academic record was not enough to shield her from the gender-based discrimination women faced in the workplace in the 1960s. She had difficulties finding a job until a favorite Columbia professor explicitly refused to recommend any other graduates before U.S. District Judge Edmund L. Palmieri hired Ginsburg as a clerk. Ginsburg clerked under Judge Palmieri for 2 years. After this, she was offered some jobs at law firms, but always at a much lower salary than her male counterparts. She instead took some time to pursue her other legal passion, civil procedure, choosing to join the Columbia Project on International Civil Procedure. The project fully immersed her in the Swedish culture, where she lived abroad to do research for her book on Swedish civil procedure practices, and upon her return to the States, accepted a job as a professor at Rutgers University Law School in 1963, a position she held until accepting an offer to teach at Columbia University Law in 1972. There, she became the first female professor at Columbia to earn tenure. Ginsburg also directed the influential Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties Union during the 1970s. In this position, she led the fight against gender discrimination and successfully argued 6 landmark cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Ginsburg took a broad look at gender discrimination, fighting not just for the women left behind, but for the men who were discriminated against as well. Ginsburg experienced her share of gender discrimination, even going so far as to hide her pregnancy from her Rutgers colleagues. Ginsburg accepted Jimmy Carter's appointment to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia in 1980. She served on the court for 13 years until 1993, when Bill Clinton nominated her to the Supreme Court of the United States. She began her career as a justice, where she left off as an advocate fighting for women's rights. In 96, Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion in the United States versus Virginia, holding that qualified women could not be denied admission to Virginia Military Institute. Her style in advocating from the bench matches her style from her time at the ACLU. Slow but steady and calculated. Instead of creating sweeping limitations on gender discrimination, she attacks specific areas of message to the legislatures on what they can and cannot do. Her attitude is a major social change should not come from the courts but from Congress and other legislatures. This method allows for social change to remain in Congress's power while also receiving guidance from the court. Ginsburg did not shy away from giving pointed guidance when she feels the need. She dissented in Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, where the plaintiff, a female worker, being paid significantly less than the males with her same qualifications, sued under Title VII but was denied relief under the statute of limitations issue. The fact that this case mixed her passion of federal procedure and gender discrimination, she broke with tradition and wrote a highly colloquial version of her dissent to read from the bench. She also called for Congress to undo this improper interpretation of the law in her dissent, and then worked with President Obama to pass the very first piece of legislation he signed, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009, a copy of which hung proudly in her office. Until her death in September 18th, 2020, Ginsburg worked with a personal trainer in the Supreme Court's exercise room for many years could lift more than both Justices Breyer and Kagan. Until the 2018 term, Ginsburg had not missed a day of oral arguments, not even when she was undergoing chemotherapy for pancreatic cancer, after surgery for colon cancer, or the day after her husband passed away in 2010. Justice Ginsburg proved time and again that she was a force to be reckoned with, and those who doubted her capacity to effectively complete her judicial duties needed only to look at her record in oral arguments. There she was until her death, among the most avid questioners on the bench. Supreme Court released a press release on September 19th, 2020 regarding her death. And yeah. Let's see. Let's go to Britannica. She was the second woman ever to serve on the Supreme Court. Younger of two children, her and her brother Nathan Bader. Was the younger of the two children of Nathan Bader. Nathan Bader was the father, a merchant, and Celia Bader. Her older sister, Marilyn, died of meningitis at the age of 6 when Joan was only 14 months old. Outside her family, Ginsburg began to go by the name Ruth in kindergarten to help her teachers distinguish her from other students named Joan. Baders were an observant Jewish family, so there's the Jewish acknowledgement. And Ruth attended synagogue and participated in Jewish traditions as a child, excelling in school where she was heavily involved in student activities and earned excellent grades. Her mother was diagnosed with cancer when she started high school, and would unfortunately perish 4 years later, just days before Ruth Bader Ginsburg's scheduled graduation ceremony, which she could not attend. So yeah. She was influenced by two other people, both professors, whom she met at Cornell. The author Vladimir Nabokov, who shaped her thinking about writing, and the constitutional lawyer Robert Cushman, who inspired her to pursue a legal career. But she got to go to Cornell on a full scholarship. When her husband Martin Ginsburg was drafted into the military, they spent 2 years in Oklahoma where he was stationed. Their daughter Jane was born, the first child. They then moved to Massachusetts, where Martin Ginsburg resumed and Ruth began studies at Harvard Law School. While she was still at Harvard, she also served on the editorial staff of the Harvard Law Review, being the first woman to do so, and was still being a mother to Jane and her husband Martin, who had been diagnosed with testicular cancer. So she's doing all kinds of things at the same time. What else do we have here we hadn't talked about? While she was a professor at Rutgers School of Law, they had their second child, James. Fought for women's liberation and gender equality, as also being with the ACLU on dealing with women's rights issues and stuff. And she even joined them with 2 draft briefs in 2 federal cases. The first being originally brought to her attention by her husband, involved a provision of the federal tax code that denied single women a tax deduction for serving as caregivers to their families. The second involved an Idaho state law that expressly preferred men to women in determining who should administer the estates of people who die without a will. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the second case, Reed versus Reed in 1971, was the first in which a gender-based statute was struck down on the basis of the Equal Protection Clause. 1972, she became a founding council of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project and co-authored a law school casebook on gender discrimination. She enjoyed cordial professional relationships with two well-known conservative judges on the court, Robert Bork and Antonin Scalia, and often voted with them. In 1993, she delivered the Madison Lecture at the New York University Law School, offering a critique for the reasoning, though not the ultimate holding, of Roe versus Wade in 1973, the case in which the Supreme Court found a constitutional right of women to choose to have an abortion. That's something that should never have been overturned. Ginsburg argued the court should have issued a more limited decision, which would have left more room for state legislatures to address specific details. Such an approach, she claimed, might have served to reduce rather than fuel controversy. Clinton announced the nomination of Ginsburg to replace retiring Justice Byron White. Her confirmation hearings were quick and relatively uncontroversial. She was endorsed unanimously by the Senate Judiciary Committee and confirmed by the Senate on August 3rd by a vote of 96-3. That's almost unanimous. So yeah. Often participating in oral arguments, she would wear jabots or collars with her judicial robes, some of which expressed a symbolic meaning. For example, both a majority opinion collar and a dissent collar. So you could tell by what she was wearing how she was going to vote. Early in her tenure on the court, Ginsburg wrote the majority's opinion in United States versus Virginia, which held that the men-only admission policy of the state-run university VMI, Virginia Military Institute, violated the Equal Protection Clause. They rejected BMI's contention that the program of military-focused education was unsuitable for women. But Ginsburg noted that the program was in fact unsuitable for the vast majority of Virginia college students, regardless of gender. Generalizations about the way women are, estimates of what is appropriate for most women, no longer justify denying opportunity to women whose talent and capacity place them outside the average description, she wrote. So yeah. She tended to vote with the other liberal justices on the court, and she got along well with most of the other conservative justices who had been appointed before her, and enjoyed a special connection with Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, and a moderate conservative. And she and conservative Justice Antonin Scalia famously bonded over their shared love of opera. Even causing American composer lyricist Derek Wang to write a comic opera, Scalia Ginsburg, celebrating their friendship. She praised work of the first Chief Justice with whom she served, William Rehnquist, another conservative. though she would have less in common with most justices appointed by Republican U.S. presidents George W. Bush and Donald J. Trump, however. And of course, this is in a period when politics in the U.S. were becoming more and more split. And so it's no wonder she had no problem with the early justices who were conservative because they had common sense. A lot of the justices, as time went on with these more conservative presidents, were more ideologically unbending. So, yeah. Ginsburg attracted attention for several strongly worded dissenting opinions and publicly read some of her dissents from the bench to emphasize the importance of the case. Two such decisions in 2007 concerned women's rights, the first being Gonzalez versus Carhart, which upheld the federal partial birth abortion ban on a 5-4 vote. Ginsburg decried the judgment as alarming, arguing that it cannot be understood as anything other than an effort to chip away at the right of women to choose to have an abortion, declared again and again by the court. Similarly, in the Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire case, another 5-4 decision, Ginsburg criticized the majority's holding that a woman could not bring federal civil suit against her employer for having paid her less than than it had paid men. The plaintiff did not become aware of her right to file suit until after the filing period had passed. Ginsburg argued that the majority's reasoning was inconsistent with the will of the U.S. Congress, a view that was somewhat vindicated when Congress passed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. With retirements of Justices David Souter in 2009 and John Paul Stevens in 2010, Ginsburg became the most senior justice within the liberal bloc. She wrote dissents articulating liberal perspectives in several more prominent and politically charged cases. Her partial dissent in the Affordable Care Act cases, which posed a constitutional challenge to the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, nicknamed Obamacare by morons, criticized her 5 conservative colleagues for concluding in her view, contrary to decades of judicial precedent, that the Commerce Clause did not empower Congress to require most Americans to obtain health insurance or pay a fine. In Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, the court's conservative majority struck down an unconstitutional Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which they have been chipping away at for years and years, trying to get rid of, which had required certain states and local jurisdictions to obtain prior approval, pre-clearance from the Federal Justice Department of any proposed changes to voting laws or procedures. Ginsburg, in dissent, criticized the proposed, where am I at? I just lost everything. Criticized the hubris of the majority's demolition of the Voting Rights Act and declared that throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Ginsburg was likewise highly critical of the majority's opinion in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby Stores 2014, a decision that recognizes the right of for-profit corporations to refuse on religious grounds to comply with the Affordable Care Act's requirement that employers pay for coverage of certain contraceptive drugs and devices in their employees' health insurance plans. Ginsburg wrote that the court had ventured into a minefield by holding that commercial enterprises can opt out of any law, saving only tax laws they judge incompatible with their sincerely held religious beliefs. And throughout her career, she concluded her dissents with the phrase, "I dissent," rather than the conventional and more common, "I respectfully dissent," which she considered an unnecessary and slightly disingenuous nicety. And of course, she gained the title Notorious RBG from a second-year law student at New York University on a Tumblr blog. She should have retired under the Obama administration, though, to allow a justice in her place, instead of giving President Dumbfuck the opportunity to fuck over the court. That's probably one of my biggest gripes with Ginsburg. But yeah. Let's see. Because she was succeeded by Amy Coney Barrett. Was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Second daughter of Celia Amster Bader and Nathan Bader. Her father was a Jewish immigrant from Odessa, Ukraine, at the time which was at the time part of the Russian Empire, and her mother was born in New York to Jewish parents who came from Krakow, Poland, at that time part of Austria-Hungary. So again, I look at her Jewish heritage. But yeah, we get a look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But with that, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.